Hello, good day. A warm welcome from the Antigua and Barbuda Cultural Information System. I am Dr. Hazra C. Medica, Cultural Advisor in the Ministry of Education, Sports and the Creative Industries. Today, we're here at the National Archives of Antigua and Barbuda with Director Mr. Gavin Emmanuel. Welcome, Mr. Emmanuel.
Thank you.
Now we're at the archives, so maybe you're thinking today's topic is the National Archives of Antigua and Barbuda, but no. Today we're going to be talking with Mr. Emmanuel about the village of Point, growing up in Point, the traditions that he grew up knowing in Point. Mr. Emmanuel, again, welcome. Tell us, what is the name for people from Point? What is it to be from Point?
Well, Point, to my mind, is one of those unique areas in Antigua and Barbuda. Many people refer to Point as a village. To be very honest, I've never heard persons from Point referring to Point as a village when I was growing up, which is kind of weird, because Point was always called an area. I did a little research and found out the way Point is designated on maps tends to be Point Division, Point Area. And it's unique in certain ways because Point is one of the few villages or areas or places in Antigua and Barbuda that actually has a definite article on the name. So it's not just Point, but the Point. You don't find many villages have that same sort of designation. So there's something unique about Point, and I think persons from Point have always seen themselves as being unique in certain ways, in ways that make Point area, the Point, a special place to be from, to grow up in, and it has really endowed Antigua and Barbuda with so much.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned the Point area. If I were to gather myself a map or several maps, how would I demark Point area? Does it start by Miss Susie's shop and by Mr. Roberto's mechanic shop? How would you demarcate that area of the Point?
That's a very interesting question, and a question that I particularly like, because growing up, what is demarcated as Point has changed over time. My earliest memory from the elders in Point was that only a very specific area in the neighborhood was designated as the Point. Now, just as you come down Newgate Street and you come around that curve from the Barnes Funeral Home, and you're going to make that left turn to go down North Street, right at that corner, apparently, there was a sign that was erected sometime in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 70s coming up. And that sign had two words on there, the Point. And so purists would tell you that the Point is really demarcated as just that very small area that was called the Point. So technically speaking, purists, the elders would tell you that the Point was just that area, just on North Street, just in that small area that was designated the Point. However, over time, the area that became known as the Point, at least earlier when I was growing up, it was just about from that corner, so thinking about Destin's Corner, and you travel along that road going straight towards Dickinson Bay Street, and when you reach Dickinson Bay Street, you're going to make that left turn to go down to the roundabout and down to where Food City, the Port Authority, is located, all of that, and then on the other side, you're going to come straight down North Street, down to where the Point Wharf is, past that, going down to where Bryson's Lumberyard used to be. And so that small area was called the Point. So technically speaking, persons who were located on the eastern side of the road by Destin's supermarket, so we're talking about Wilkerson's Cross now, persons who were located on the eastern side of the road historically never viewed themselves as being from the Point. However, over time, that area east, so we're now traveling upwards. So if you imagine it, going up Bishopgate Street and then St. John Street. So if you look at where Brownie's Bakery presently is, there was a time where all of there was not considered to be purely part of the Point. But of course, over time, all of those areas became part of the Point, so much so that the Point extended as far east up to where the Pope's Head Street. So anything on the western side of Pope's Head Street, going as far across as Newgate Street and going across to Dickinson Bay Street and going all the way down to the roundabout, all of that was seen now as being a part of Point. And if you look at it, because while historically persons on Point did not see it that way, if you look at it right now, those areas that I just mentioned, so everything west of Pope's Head Street, going across the Dickinson Bay Street and across the Newgate Street and going right down, all of that is now part of City West constituency, which is a part of Point. So for in terms of an electoral district, it's now part of that, and so I suspect that historically it was always seen as part and parcel of that area that was designated the Point.
Now, I've known you for 2 or 20 years, something like that, and I was always under the belief that you were from the august village of Villa. So you're telling me now you're from Point. What era are we talking about? When, in terms of growing up in Point, what are we talking about? Not to age you, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s? What's the span that we're talking about, you growing up in the Point?
Yeah, well, I was born in 1977 in the Point. So most of my memories of the Point would be from about early 80s when I really came to know myself and became conscious of who I was and where I was from and so on. Interestingly, speaking about Villa as well, because I just mentioned about the demarcation between Villa and Point. Dickinson Bay Street has been a traditional demarcation, and so the important thing to note here is that I think the demarcation between Villa and Point is really artificial. As a matter of fact, Villa is more or less an extension of Point because of land issues in Point. There was a time where there was not enough land in Point, and so persons had to find places to live, and Villa, being the closest area that had available land, naturally became part of that. But my experiences within Point would be from the early 1980s up until present day. Yeah.
Okay, growing up in the Point, who were some of the significant or influential people that everybody knew, whether it be in the field of calypso, sports, that sort of thing?
Well, we had quite a number of famous people, well-known people within the Point. Of course, Sir Gavin Emmanuel, King Shortshirt. He was very influential, very respected. King Shortshirt was, a lot of people saw King Shortshirt in Antigua as a calypso king. In Point, King Shortshirt was like a village king, right? He was a person who was well respected. I remember, as young kids, at the time, King Shortshot used to live up St. George's Street. And we used to go up by King Shortshot. His children were playmates and so on. But King Shortshot's house was a place of almost a place of a spiritual experience where you went to get guidance, you went to get knowledge. King Shortshot himself was a disciplinarian, and so he was a person who, when he spoke, the community respected his voice. He was a person of wisdom, and so he was well respected within the community. And then we had other Calypsonians. We had Redding, for example, was from the point. Squilly was from the point as well. Of course, a little while after, we had people like Zachary and so on. But what is instructive is that a lot of Calypsonians from different parts of Antigua used to come to King Shortshot's home, because this was like a spiritual pilgrimage, that if you want to be in Calypso, make your pilgrimage to King Shortshot's home. You'll glean something, you'll get some wisdom, he will help you to grow in the Calypso field. Then we had, of course, Brownie's Bakery, Bertsfield Martin, and his mom, Miss Brownie, who is actually a relative of mine. And Bertsfield was not only involved with the bakery, but sports. West Ham Football Club could not have existed presently without the input of Mr. Bertsfield Martin, Mojo. Very, very, very important person in the point. And then we had a lot of other notable persons as well. For example, Wilmoth Daniel, for example, would always tell you that his roots are in point. When Bryson's lumberyard was located right in the heart of Point, one of my fondest memories was of Wilmoth Daniel as the general manager down at Bryson's. And Bryson's was an important place because not only was it there for lumber and so on, but whenever we had drought, Bryson's used to have a huge cistern in the yard. And whenever there was drought, that's where we used to go and get water. And persons like Wilmot Daniel were very kind to the people of Point to allow us to use the resources at Bryson's so that we could get water and so on. And so, so these are some of the people. In all endeavors, in business and so on, they're very prominent persons, many of whom over time would have moved elsewhere, but they would have traced their roots in the Point. Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about the experience of, there being a drought and where you'd get water. What are some of the other childhood memories you have of, living in Point and the peculiar things that you had to do, whether it's to get water? Back then, did you have a stove or was it wood fired?
Yeah, well, back then, a lot of persons would use coal pots. Stoves were there, but it's a weird sort of thing, Many persons used their stoves only for specific occasions, right? So, back then, many of the stoves were not the large stoves with ovens and so on. We're talking about a 2 or 3 burner stove that had no oven, right? Again, I can even remember some persons, while some of these stoves would use propane gas, there are others that actually were kerosene. Yeah, so they actually used kerosene as the fuel for these stoves. But most persons would use coal pots at that time. And you would have to buy charcoal. There were different persons in the community who sold charcoal. You had Miss Eileen, you had Miss Marian, you had Miss Pansy, all of these people are persons who would sell charcoal. And so meals preparation, a funny thing, when I was growing up, fast food and so on were not very popular in Antigua, right? Of course, there was KFC, because apparently KFC was Chicken King back when it came about. And from Chicken King, it kind of morphed into KFC and so on. But a lot of persons were not affluent persons. You didn't have a lot of disposable income. And so patronizing what was then fast food places, it was far and few between. Those were just special occasions. Fast food for us. So we used to use fruits as fast food. So you go around to the community, and somebody has a sauce-up tree. You raided that sauce-up tree until the meal was finished, your real meal was finished. And we're talking about sometimes the sauce-ups are not even ripe. Mango trees. One again up Rat Island, just next to the Port Authority. There was a time where that was publicly accessible, right? So it wasn't fenced or anything. You could make your way up to the hill. And up Rat Island had quite a few fruit trees. It had mangoes, it had cashew. As a matter of fact, one of the few places in the point that actually had a cashew tree was up Rat Island. And we used to, that was like, again, a boyhood thing where every weekend we'd go up to Rat Island to look mangoes, soursop, cashew, and we used to have this thing we used to call gang house. So we used to go up there, you build a little gang house. It was like a little clubhouse for the boys, and you went up there, you walked with your pot, you would use, we used to call them caterpillar back in the day. More genteel term is catapult, but we used to call it caterpillar, where you made it from a white stick, and you had the rubber bands on it, and you use a piece of leather, shoe tongue, to make the hold where you'd put the stone in. And we'd use those caterpillar to catch birds, right? So especially during the summer, the boys would form themselves into small groups of 5 or 6 persons, and you went out, you catch these birds, and you went to your gang house and you dub a pot. So you cook some rice, so you'd walk with your rice and everything and so on before, and you caught the birds, you kill the birds, clean them up and everything, and you roast the birds, you cook some rice. That's a meal there. So those are the kinds of experiences, the kinds of fast food, the kinds of things that we did. So, the fast food culture, that's now, we didn't have that. We had to make do with what was available to us. So it was, a lot of birds, different animals. Sometimes, we used to go around the community because many persons would raise their own chickens. And we used to go around the community, any stray chicken we saw.
Stray.
Yeah, just the stray ones.
Yeah.
We didn't trouble the ones that we knew were owned.
Yes.
Just the stray ones. We'd take maybe a chicken or two, and we'd partake of that. We roasted and we would divide it among the boys. Those were nice experiences, really nice experiences.
So go back to the foraging for fruits. I'm going to put it that way, foraging
Yes.
for fruits. I didn't imagine you had a stick and you would gently, tell me about how you used to peel mango, that kind of thing.
Well, we had some fellas that, looking back at it, these guys were talented. One of the guys who I always admired, even up to now, is a young man by the name of Adrian Peters. We used to call him Bobby. Now, Bobby was an amazing guy, Bobby was a guy who, he was good with his hands. So he could make kites, he could play marbles, he could climb trees. Fascinating sort of guy, very multifaceted, multi-talented guy. And you're talking about at the age of 8, 9 and so on. This young man, Bobby, would be climbing some of the highest coconut trees you knew. So to get coconuts, one of the guys would climb the tree. To get some fruits, one of the guys would, go and do some picking. And most of the guys could climb, but you had some guys who were just exceptional at this stuff. So yes, sometimes you'd pelt stones, you'd use sticks and so on, but because you had these guys who were so proficient, we didn't normally have to resort to doing that. Quite a few times, you had quite a few stray dogs, not saying anything about the dogs in people's yards. And while you're picking fruits, a stray dog or two might run you over a fence or two, right? But those were the memories. Those were things that we used to gather afterwards and just joke about these things. Boy, remember we had to jump over the fence there. Again, back in the day, just up North Street, just up from Papacy to Destin, we had Bryden. They used to have a warehouse in that area. And in the yard of Bryden, there used to be mango trees. There's like 2 or 3 mango trees in that yard. And we used to go up at Bryden's in the evenings to get mangoes. And after a while, Bryden's decided to put dogs in the yard. And so some of the guys would have to go and distract the dogs while others went and got some mangoes. And it was just a source of childhood fun. Looking back at it, it's not so fun now because you realize somebody could have been bitten up by a dog or something. But at the time as kids, we're not thinking about that. All we know, we saw two nice juicy mangoes. We wanted some mangoes and went to get some mangoes. But yeah, those we made do with what was available to us, and it was really something that helped us to grow as individuals as well.
What about the community spirit? What was the community spirit like?
I've often heard people saying that we've moved away from some of our traditional values. Things like the communal living. We had, there was a strong sense of community in Point. I know growing up, I was seen, as were the other boys, other young people in the village, we're seen not necessarily as your family's child alone, but you're a child of the community. What used to happen is that persons, if you did anything out of the way, before you got home, your parents and grandparents would know. And now this is something too that I want to emphasize. The structure of the family was fundamentally different. Because most of the persons I know growing up, they weren't just living in a home with a mother and father. There was a mother, father, grandfather, grandmother, aunties, uncles, cousins. So the family structure was very broad-based. So you grew up in a house with cousins who were like brothers and sisters to you. So your cousins weren't just living apart. Yes, they may live in their own house, but certainly they always came together at a particular point, usually the grandparents' home. And the grandparents' home was like the focal point of activity. So if you did something out of the way, the neighbors were always there looking over your shoulder. And, as children, we hated it. I can't say that I liked it as a child. We hated it because, you'll be there making fun, horsing around with the other boys, and you did something out of the way, and all you heard, "Make up the word to tell Nella now." And the minute you reach home, that complaint was over your shoulder. So I was seen not just as a child of my family, but a child of Point. I remember there was a gentleman we used to call Molly. And one day I remember I was coming from church. It was during a weekday, we went to practice. I was coming from church and I was coming down the road, and I didn't know Molly was close to me, close by. And there's a older guy who was troubling me. he was interfering with me and so on, harassing me. I kept walking, and the guy was coming closer and closer to me. And all I heard I just heard the voice. Molly said, "Hey, don't interfere with him." Right? Now, this guy wasn't somebody from Point, right? And then, we walked on and so on, and we went down the road. I said to Molly, thanks. And he said like to me, like, "Gavin, a Point to come from now. You can't make nobody trouble, Right? And this is the way we grew up. So we had people like Molly, we had Uchamin, Conrad White, Uchamin. Molly was Everton Francis, right? Conrad White, Molly, Uchamin. We had Lion and Leopard, Tiger, all of these guys. So Uchamin, Lion, Leopard, Tiger, Zulu, all of them from the same family, all brothers. And again, these were men who you grew up with, who nurtured you. I remember Zulu, for example. You're going to the shop, and Zulu would call you and tell you, "Sit down here." And he puts a newspaper in your hand, and he tells you, "Read this newspaper, read this article before you leave here." Sometimes you say to Zulu, "Look, my grandmother sent me to the shop. She said, must come back right now." He said, "Look, man, take 5 minutes and read the article." Right? And so we had those kinds of experiences, and the paper that he preferred at the time was the Outlet newspaper. And there would be these interesting articles. I remember one time he showed me an article about a new animal, like an antelope that they discovered, a different species that they really, these little interesting things. And so you're going to the shop and you say, "Hey, come here, man, sit down here, read this article here." And you're protesting. No, just read the article. When you go to home, tell your grandmother, is like, keep it for 5 minutes. And what they were doing is that they were inculcating in us a sense of who we are, a bit of knowledge, getting us into the habit of reading, getting us in tune with what was happening around us and so on. And so you had this almost a sense that they were extended family. They weren't just the gentleman down the road or this gentleman across the road. And these are people who looked out for you, the people who your parents, they're people who your parents trusted. That if Zulu went and told your parents you did something out the way, you did something out the way. Because Zulu not coming to your parents if you didn't do something out the way. So, growing up and knowing that, there was always this sense of respect. Because you don't know who was watching and when. Because a lot of times you didn't see these people, but they were there, right? And you got home and your parents would say, "Oh, you think I didn't know you did X or you did Y?" And half the times you didn't even know who lodged the complaint. So your parents' eyes became the community. And it helped to mold us into who we are. I wish sometimes, probably wishing in vain, that we would get back to that sort of sense of community. The family structures change forever, so I don't think we'd ever get back there.
I noted interest as you talk, you're referencing people by nicknames. How important were nicknames in creating that sense of self? And did you always know, the origin of a nickname? Did you know why Tiger was called Tiger, or Leopard, and Lion, and that sort of thing? That's a very interesting question. Funny is that no, we never knew why these people were called these nicknames. And again, a lot of these gentlemen, you didn't know their real names until you grew up, because growing up, that's all you knew them as. But nicknames were important because the nicknames are what identified a person as uniquely them. Because a lot of these nicknames are not nicknames that would be shared by anybody else. I mean, you have a nickname like Mukush, for example. I can't remember anybody else with a nickname like Mukush, right? I mean, we had people like Mr. Wang, right? Peter Martin. Then you had the erstwhile Tila Parker. Again, Tila. I've never heard anybody else with the nickname Tila,
right? So we had these guys with these nicknames, and I would say maybe as much as 90% of the people I grew up with all had nicknames, and we never really used their real names unless it's in a formal context or something. For example, King Shortshot, for example, nobody called him McLean. I mean, you're forward, or you called the King McLean, you know. Redding, same thing. George Messiah, but it's Redding we know him as. So the nicknames were very unique. Even Papacita Destin, for example, again a nickname, Papacita, right? So almost.
Wait, you're telling me Papacita isn't his name?
Not as far as I'm aware. Not as far as I'm aware.
When you think you know a person.
Yeah, not as far as I'm aware. I stand to be corrected, but as far as I know, Papacita is likely a nickname, right? You know, but yeah, again, but these are the people, and these are the sorts of things that you go up with, where again, many of the people you never knew. And some persons have died. You don't know what their name. We had a gentleman there in Point. He had a reputation for being probably the most resilient person in Point. We used to call him Colonel. Now, Colonel was a man who he had very unsteady balance. So Colonel would have to walk. He used to use 2 sticks to walk. And Colonel was reputed, why we call him the most resilient man in Point. Colonel was reputed to have gone through several hurricanes living in an old refrigerator.
Okay.
Right? So he used to live on North Street. Now there's a large silk cotton tree. You see, just in the vicinity of where Harmonite's Panyard is, just close to the roadside, there was a very large silk cotton tree there. And that silk cotton tree was a liming area. So persons used to build fish pots there. People used to go there and, you know, sit down and socialize and so on. And there was a wall on the eastern side, and Colonel used to live in a fridge, an old refrigerator, gutted out. He used to live in the refrigerator, sleeping there and so on, right there by that silk cotton tree. And Colonel was reputed to have gone through several hurricanes in that refrigerator and came out unscathed, right? And again, somebody like Colonel, I don't know the gentleman's correct name. We had a gentleman down there we used to call Guavi Joey. Don't know his real name. There was a gentleman we used to call Wizard. Don't know his real name. No, Wizard was a gentleman who had a large guinea tree in his yard. Now, Wizard used to live right there on St. John Street, just where Tila Parker lives right now. Wizard used to live in the house just next to Tila Parker, on the eastern side of Tila Parker. And Wizard used to have a huge guinea tree in his backyard. And again, young boys, guinea in season, you want to go out there, go up in that guinea tree to get some guinea. And we used to go and raid that guinea tree whenever Wizard was inside, or you feel Wizard gone somewhere. And sometimes Wizard would just appear out of thin blue, out of the thin air, while you're up in the tree and so on. But again, a gentleman like Wizard, who didn't know his real name. So a lot of the characters, we never knew their real names. It was just by the nickname. And the minute you mention Wizard, everybody in Point know who you're talking about. Right? You say Tiger, everybody in Point know you're talking. Lion, everybody in Point know. So the nicknames became almost as a signifier, an identifier that made you uniquely you and was different from any other nickname from anybody else outside of the community.
Okay. You mentioned the silk cotton tree, and you've mentioned one or two stories of legends and that. What do you think is an enduring myth or legend as it surrounds the Point? You know, like a particular village might have a story that there can only be 99 artisans of a certain type there. Is there anything like that about the Point as we wrap up today's look at the Point?
You know, if the thing that I find uniquely Point, and maybe something that is I hope we find a way to preserve it. Booby Alley, right? Booby Alley is as uniquely Point as Point itself. Now, Booby Alley, now, of course, there's the new development taking place there. And I think this is a great development, actually, the housing there. But Booby Alley was a unique place in Point, in the sense that it was a small area, but it was extremely densely populated. And it only had walking space, alleys, basically. So cars and so on couldn't drive in Booby Alley. Now, Booby Alley is the kind of place, if you're not a true Point person, you could easily get lost in between Booby Alley. Because you'd go through one alley, make a turn, make another turn, and you end back up right at the same spot you started when you started. So Booby Alley was very uniquely Point. But not only was Booby Alley a place of where people lived, Booby Alley was a place of community as well, right? So in between Booby Alley, I mean, you had the joints where persons would go and drink their booze and so on, which is another thing, because some people will tell you that Booby Alley, the name Booby Alley is a corruption of Booze Alley, Booze, because it was reputed that in the days when people used to smuggle alcohol into Antigua, of course, Point Wharf was just next door, so you smuggled in the late night, you'd come off the boat, you went straight between Booby Alley or Booze Alley, you deposited there, and from there the booze would get distributed. So it was called Booze Alley. Another story I've heard about the origin of Booze Alley was not booze as in Booze, but booze as in Boos, so as being like a spooky place. And the reason for that is that way back, that whole area there, where Bethel Church is and just the immediate environs, apparently was a graveyard, right? It was a graveyard during slavery. And apparently the legend goes that Booze Alley was a spooky place. So it's like, boo, that sort of thing, right? So the jury is still out as to what's the origin of Booby Alley is. But there are stories, for example, that persons would hire taxis from up in town and come down in Point and say, drop me here, let me go inside and get the money and come back. And the minute the person go through Booby Alley, taxi man can't find the person, right? So the idea is that Booby Alley was uniquely Point, and I've known situations of persons, in order to try to prove their pedigree as a person from the Point, would claim, Booby Alley me born, or, you born in a Point, but a Booby Alley me born. So that Booby Alley was seen as being quintessentially Point, right? And so you couldn't claim to be from Point if you didn't know about Booby Alley, because Booby Alley, and again, even you look at where it's located, it is probably the most central region of Point, and so that physical location became a metaphor for its centrality within the community, the centrality of purpose that it served within the community.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel, for this look at the Point, and I want to thank our videographer, Mr. Jeremiah Joseph, for being here with us today. Thank you so much. I'm sure all in Antigua and Barbuda will enjoy this journey into the Point.
Thank you.